Okay, just wanted to let you know that I've looked at the schedule for next week and what's likely for us and probably what's likely for you. So what I intend to do is, instead of having the Monday night class and the Tuesday afternoon class, is we're just going to have one class for everybody, and that's going to be on Sunday at noon Eastern time for next week. Sunday at noon Eastern time. So if you know of somebody that's in the class and you don't see them on here tonight, just pass the word along, and I will send it out by email, but I know you guys don't open all your emails. Let's just get that out of the way. And of course, this time of year, if you want to see crazy, just look in your inbox, because they do start coming out of the woodwork. It's, I don't know, it's so predictable, but it's still unpleasant this time of year, because, you know, when the spirit of Adonai is moving in a special way because of the feasts and the season and so forth, it is going to stir up a lot of ugly, dark stuff. So don't be surprised. Like I said, we're warned in the book of Jude that there are people who are sent to us, especially for the purpose of shipwrecking us during the feasts. So have fun, have joy, but watch your back. That's my word of the day. So our goal, I guess, within the next week or two is to finish workbook 2 as it exists today, because as it will exist once I put all the new material in there, it's going to be about 2/3 bigger than it is right now. So that's how much, I believe, new information we've covered over the past year. And so as we go into these last sevens, the 7 bowls of wrath, I just want to go back again to first century context. And in fact, and it's not a rabbit trail I want to go down, but it's a rabbit trail worth going down. I know there's a lot of teachers out there doing work with the principle of honor and shame. And historians have maybe a little bit different type of vocabulary as they're dealing with first century groups. But I want to straighten out for you before we get to the end of workbook 2, what was going on in the Holy Land in the first century, so that never again can we look at the Gospels in exactly the same way, which is oversimplified, where we would say all the Pharisees were bad, all the Sadducees were bad, all the scribes were bad, Samaritans were good, because those are the stories we grew up on. We tend to continue believing them. And it's never that simple. We should know by now that studying scripture is never that simple, that there were all kinds of groups. And because the gospel writers focused quite a bit on the Sadducees as they interacted with Yeshua, some of that's going to be very necessary, because he represents the core of their doctrinal beliefs, which is resurrection from the dead, a final judgment, and then either eternal reward or punishment, and a bodily resurrection. The body itself would actually be transformed and not just some disembodied spirit floating around the universe somewhere. So they had their core beliefs they held in common, but it was many times in their applications of the oral law especially that they were different. And I don't want you to get into, well, the Pharisees believed this or the Pharisees believed that. We just discussed what we can say is true of the whole group. But they're like any other group. If I say Christians believe this, well, we know that there's a huge spectrum between the most conservative denominations of Christianity to the most liberal denominations of Christianity, and we would never identify ourselves with that group of Christians if somebody tried to pin that label upon us. And that's why I say it's not going to be that simple, but if we don't understand a little bit about the dynamics among the Pharisees or between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, or between the Pharisees and the Zealots, or between the Pharisees and the Essenes. And those would be probably semester-long courses, every one of them, just because of the historical research that's out there. I'm really only concerned in how it helps you decode what you're reading in the Gospels and Revelation, because Yeshua makes a lot of apocalyptic statements that we get more information from John in the book of Revelation. And there's two statements in the book of Revelation that have historically been taken out of context by Christians. I'm sure most of them were well-meaning, but a few of them were not. And they have become the basis for those stereotypes that made it so much easier to burn Jews at the stake, or to have an inquisition, or to borrow all the money you could borrow and then kick all the Jews out of your country so you wouldn't have to pay them back. That sort of stuff has been repeated in every generation. Even Hitler used the New Testament as justification for what he did. Now, anybody can do that, but when it's a pattern in every generation, we have to look at it and say, okay, let's go back to the verses they're looking at and say, what did it mean in the first century? Not what do I want it to mean right now because a Jew offended me on the street and I want to call him the synagogue of Satan. What did it mean then to be a Pharisee? Was it a good thing? Was it a bad thing? What did it mean to be a Sadducee? Was it a good thing or bad thing? Nothing is that simple. What we can do is define basic beliefs and then point out the departures from their beliefs as they interacted with Yeshua, because Yeshua had a lot of interaction with what we would call hypocrites. But if he came to correct and to prepare the kingdom, then who do you imagine he would have the most interaction with? Hypocrites, people who weren't doing their job. And because the Pharisees truly had the heart of the common person, not the Sadducees, because they were rich, they were wealthy, and they would have been considered more associated with the patron class, which is why I say a lot of work that Rico and Ryan White, and there's some others out there working with the honor and shame paradigm. Like I say, there's different, maybe more exacting structures within the first century, but the Pharisees would have been known as a retainer class. What do we mean by retainer class? It means they probably weren't independently wealthy. A few might have been, like Nicodemus. He may have been, but he didn't represent the whole. As a group, they tended to depend upon people in power and sometimes work with people in power in order to affect religious change. Now, the danger in that, let's say you're a Pharisee and you're into, Jewish ethics and living according to the Torah and teaching people to rightly divide the word of truth, making sure the common person understood it, keeping a check on the Sadducees, which was very much a political office at the time. The temptation might be, not just in the first century, but in the century prior, BC. From time to time, there were groups of Pharisees that were tempted to become part of political or military intrigues, like with the Herodians. And it seems like every single time they got tied up in a political intrigue, a bunch of people got killed or crucified. At one point, I believe Alexander, you might see him called Yanai, if you read it from a Jewish source, he actually crucified 800 Pharisees. And so this would have been pre-Yeshua time. So there's lots of history about the Pharisees that kind of goes by us. And it's because we don't take history classes like that typically to help us understand what we're reading. But that's the danger as we get in to some of this history that I think is important to decoding the synagogue of Satan. That's very much a part of John's vision. We have to be so careful not to typecast every single Pharisee as being this way, or every single Sadducee as being this way, or every single Essene as being this way. When as you dig into the historical records, you realize that you can't make one statement that represents the whole group, especially as the generations pass by. Groups are going to grow and so forth. I mean, how would you describe Hebrew roots 2 generations ago? Probably non-existent, but we did actually have some predecessors. There was a group of scholars that started to lay some work down in Hebrew roots. In fact, the founding fathers of America were very big into Hebrew roots. But as you look at our history, we can't look at our history and say this is, a very orderly way of describing it. It's the most disorderly thing. Religion is the most disorderly conversation you'll ever have. And that was the caution with the Pharisees as a group, because they weren't the independently wealthy types like many of the Sadducees or the ruling class. The temptation was to get involved heavily in the politics, because the politicians realized that the Pharisees did have the heart of the common person up until we get to revolutionary stage. And then that stage changes, because at their core, a Pharisee was more of a reformist, more into reforming the existing system than creating a revolution and just overthrowing everything. And when they got to revolution point, of course, the Pharisees are going to pull back a little bit and say, no, that gets us in trouble. That gets us crucified big time. But those periods or groups in history where they were tempted to get into the political intrigues of their day, whether it was with Greek or Rome or with the local governing authorities, it tended to go badly. You can only get, as a believer, as someone that's walking out your faith, and for us being a believer in Yeshua, you're only going to be able to get so close to the government. And governments tend to have growth periods and then death periods, growth periods, death periods. And if you get caught up supporting the wrong person at the wrong time, then there's going to be backlash. And that's what worries me about this generation, and specifically within the last couple of years, is that at least American politics has become so polarized, so extreme, to the point that even people of faith would believe that if you're a true believer, you support this person, or if you're a true believer, you would never support this person. It's really odd to watch how involved people of faith have become in politics, as though the answer is there. And the answer really isn't there. We are to pray for those in authority over us, which is a very Pharisaical lesson that they learned the hard way. When you think of 800 people being crucified, and the report is that they ended up crucifying them in very hideous positions because they ran out of room. They ran out of material. So it was pretty bad. But for us, I think we have to be really careful. It's not that you can't be involved in politics, but I don't think we should be spending more time analyzing the politics of the day than we're spending on analyzing the Torah portion of the day. Because those governments, the history tells us they rise and they fall, they rise and they fall, they rise and they fall. But the kingdom is going to last forever. And the king is going to last forever. And the more you know about his kingdom and his system of ruling, And the better friends you make with him and his people, then I think eternally the better off we're going to be. Because before we know it, what started out as a sincere exercise of faith, all of a sudden we realize it's not really a faith thing at all. It's just a man-made political thing. So we have to be really careful there and not get carried away with the day. So let's go back again and let's review the two houses of the Pharisees, because this there is a symbol within what we know about the house of Shammai. There were two houses of the Pharisees. One was the house of Shammai, and one was the house of Hillel. And Shammai is known as the more strict of the two. Hillel would have been the more compassionate in most cases in how he ruled on the law. And of course, the big argument against the Pharisees, whether it's Shammai or Hillel, is that they were adding to the Torah, that they were building fences around the Torah that nobody could keep. But if we look at Yeshua's Sermon on the Mount, that's exactly what he was doing. He was putting fences around the Torah. He is saying things like, you have heard it said, and then he would basically quote out of the Torah. He would say, but I say to you, it's this way. And his way would be harder than just the letter of the Torah, because he rendered the spirit of the Torah. He would add that extra fence, like, if you just look at the woman to lust after her, you've committed it in your heart. So don't even look at her like that. Whereas the letter of the law would not hold you guilty for just thinking about it. But Yeshua says, if it's already in your heart and you're thinking it, then you're guilty. You've already begun the sin at that point. So it's not as though Yeshua didn't put rabbinic fences around the Torah. We just don't seem to object to his like we do to the Pharisees. But the story goes that, and this is one of the major stories about the two founders, we might say, of the Pharisees, or as we would understand Pharisaism. They had two different ways of dealing with converts. Shammai's method of dealing with a convert was to take a measuring rod. We've heard a stick of wood before, and the longer I researched that, the less accurate it seemed to be. The sources, the better sources, are saying what he did is he picked up a measuring rod to push away the Gentiles who asked to be converted. He tended to accept only wealthy, educated, and socially upward students. He was like the Yale or the Harvard of Pharisees. And he did scorn converts. He was the more strict in his rulings. The last of the breed, we might say, in those last years, when the Second Temple is being destroyed, and what we would know as the Pharisaical, Sadducean, Essene groups of Judaism, they're beginning to fade off the scene, which sheds a lot of light, I believe, historically on John's vision. At that time, there is one rabbi in particular from the house of Shammai. And it's because of this maverick rabbi from the house of Shammai that there's a phrase we can understand. And that phrase is the synagogue of Satan, which is appearing in the book of Revelation. Another way of saying it is the seed of Satan. I believe John called it brood of vipers. So there's going to be a scriptural context, and then there's going to be a newer, we might say, context of the first century. And what we're going to find out at the end of this trail is that whether you were Jew or not Jew, it could be describing you. Because John is using the word synagogue in the book of Revelation, it comes across as, well, these could only be Jews who are the synagogue of Satan. But there's a background behind calling someone a brood of vipers, or the serpent, the seed of Satan, the synagogue of Satan. Remember, Shammai and Hillel, their differences in their practices probably were forcing them into separate synagogues. And so, as you're walking by, you look at this synagogue, and if this is somebody you disagree with, if you're a Republican, you walk by and you say, yeah, that's the seed of Satan in there. That's the synagogue of Satan. Or if you're a Democrat, you walk by the Republican meeting house and you say, oh, that's the brood of vipers. That's the synagogue of Satan right there. Depends on who you think you are in relation to who you think they are. But this particular rabbi, it's because of him, because it's recorded about him. His name was Rabbi Eliezer. And we have records where he was called the seed of Satan by the house of Hillel. And they called him the seed of Satan because of two things that he practiced. And one you're already familiar with, because Yeshua spoke into that decades before. First, they called him the seed of Satan because he practiced polygamy. He was married to 2 wives. And this is evidence that he's going with the more literalist interpretation of the house of Shammai, whereas the Hillelites object to polygamy. And they say it's not the letter, it's not authorizing polygamy, it's acknowledging that polygamy exists. It existed in those times, and they even interpreted the levirate marriage differently. But their belief was the original pattern and the spirit of the commandment was 1 man and 1 woman. And Yeshua tends to teach that way. He says, in the beginning, it was not so. How was it in the beginning? 1 man, 1 woman. The second practice that earned him this label, seed of Satan, was that he authorized the dedication of all your goods to the temple, even if it would prevent you from fulfilling your obligations to other people. And Yeshua had already rebuked that, saying you can't dedicate your goods to the temple and not take care of your mother and father. That's the weightier commandment. And so these workarounds that sometimes occurred under Shammai were significant. And so sometimes this would earn them the label synagogue of Satan, seed of Satan. But this more literalist Shammai was known for his measuring rod. And remember, coming out of there, this is kind of where we're hearing this seed of Satan epithet. If we look at Revelation 11:1, John talks about a rod. And this rod is related to the Gentiles. He says, there was given me a reed like unto a rod. And the angel stood, saying, rise, and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. So we don't want to make too much of that prophecy. That's not really a road we want to go down. What I want you to see there in that passage is that the measuring rod is related to the Gentiles being in the temple area. And eventually, Shammai is going to be responsible ultimately. Now, there's another long story about Bar Kamsa, and maybe sometime I can get Rabbi Krieger on here to teach about Bar Kamsa. and how it was one of those old lady that swallowed the fly stories that ended up in the destruction of the Second Temple. But one of the things that was happening in the time of Yeshua, the house of Shammai was prevailing. It wasn't till the destruction of the Second Temple that you start to see the house of Hillel come into prominence in terms of their more lenient rulings. But in Yeshua's day, it was Shammai who prevailed. And sometimes they would work with the Sadducees, which were more of a political class of people. Most of the chief priests, elders, and scribes, a large percentage of those were going to be Pharisees. And they tried to keep it hereditary. So in terms of pecking order, the Sadducees are going to be higher than the Pharisees. But remember, the Pharisees had the heart of the common person. So they needed the Pharisees to keep the people from, you know how rowdy Israelites are, from starting a revolution. And so sometimes the Pharisees, they would work with the Sadducees, or with the house of Hillel. Specifically, there were periods where they worked with the zealots, who were assassins. And there was even an incident where some of those assassins assassinated students from the house of Hillel. But these zealots definitely were revolutionaries. So I say there's this overlap here that is so confusing to us after the fact because we didn't live in that period. And it's in that crossover of influence that Shammai actually rendered a ruling that we've talked about before, where as a Gentile would go into the temple to offer sacrifices, and historically the temple had also always received sacrifices from Gentiles. Now it had to be kosher, obviously, but they would make those offerings on behalf of Gentiles. Remember, Shammai does not think that Gentiles have any part in the world to come. Take their money, but don't make their sacrifice. And when Yeshua overturns the money changers' tables, that's part of the problem. And I want to look at the verse that he quoted tonight, where he says, "It is written, my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." Shammai didn't necessarily believe that the way that Yeshua did. And so under Shammai, this ruling was put into place where basically they are taking Gentile money in return for sacrifices that are never made. And finally, it comes to a political head, and they just shut down making sacrifices. And so a Roman emperor sends the money to make the sacrifice for him, and they refuse it. And before you know it, you have a Roman army on your doorstep, ready to tear down the temple. So oddly, one of the big problems at the heart of all this intrigue was the fact that with Shammai's assistance in earlier rulings that influenced some of the later practices when the house of Shammai is in power, eventually they shut down and just refused to take any Gentile sacrifices up. Gentiles have no part. And so Shammai taking the measuring rod to push the Gentiles away who are coming to him asking to convert. Remember, this is pre-Yeshua. And it's significant that it's the measuring rod with which he pushes them away. Basically, when you read prophecy about the temple, the people will be given a measuring rod. And so what's the message there from Shammai? I'm taking this measuring rod that measures the temple, that takes the measure of the temple, and I'm going to push you away because you have no part with us. There's no way that you can be brought into the covenant. Hillel was just the opposite. And as far as time period, Hillel would have died probably around 10 AD when Yeshua would have been a young boy. And he's best known for the same three converts that went to Shammai, because once they went to Shammai and he pushes them away, we realize that he does have a heart for the convert, even though Yeshua is going to rebuke some people in his group for the conversions and then what they lead the people to do once they convert them. Remember, the first one comes and he says, teach me the entire Torah while I'm standing on one foot. Of course, Shammai is going to push him away. That's very presumptuous to say. Seriously, that's the more literalist interpretation. But for Hillel, it's true, there are no shortcuts to serving Adonai. However, the Gentile already didn't measure up. If we want to look at that measuring rate, he already didn't measure up to Shammai. And so the idea that the rod, this measuring rod, which had initially pushed the Gentiles away, and then there was going to be a period of history that pulled them back in, but then we can see a separation that John is talking about, that there's going to be this outer court. A change is going to be required of the Gentiles in order for them to come in closer. And that's why we want to go to Isaiah eventually here. The second one says, okay, I'll convert to Judaism, or to Pharisaism in this case, but convert me on the condition that you only teach me the written Torah. Okay, now we've heard that one before. We've heard that one pretty frequently. Hillel dealt with the first guy standing on one foot. He says, whatever's hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go and learn. Get to the essence of the thing, simplify it, and then go back and study the details. He absolutely ignored the arrogance of the challenge. With number two, he kind of did the same thing. Hillel is patient, but he's also smart. And so, whereas you really cannot learn, let's take, for instance, the doctrine of the resurrection. If I just gave you the first 5 books of the Bible, you'd probably never come up with a doctrine of resurrection all by yourself if somebody hadn't already taught you that. It would be the equivalent of saying, somebody says they want to become a U.S. citizen, and they say, okay, I'll accept the Constitution, but I'm not going to accept any of those amendments. I'm not going to accept the local laws. I don't have to obey the traffic laws. I don't have to do stop signs. I don't have to, pay taxes, anything like that, but I do accept the Constitution. Well, that's no way to become a citizen. And to Shammai, it's no way to become a Jew. But Hillel's pretty crafty. And so he says, okay, I'm going to teach you the first 3 letters so that I can teach you the written Torah. So he teaches them Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet. So the potential convert goes away. He comes back the next day. And Hillel teaches them to him in a completely different order. And the potential convert says, what are you doing? You taught me yesterday it's Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, and now you're telling me it's this. And Hillel says, look, if you're going to have to rely on me just to recognize the letters of the Torah, then you're going to have to also rely on me to explain to you how the Torah is to be understood. And the scriptural basis for that is Deuteronomy 12:21, where Moses says, as I have instructed you, and there are no instructions. In other words, there was some other instruction that took place. And so this is where we get the idea that's passed on by the apostles, that private interpretation of the Torah, which is prophecy, is dangerous and it's arrogant. And if you have to rely on somebody just to teach you A, B, C, and D, of the language it's written in, then you might have to rely on them to help you understand some of that written text. The third challenge was, remember the potential convert, he was walking by the house of study, and he hears them talking about the beautiful garments of the high priest. He decides he wants to be a high priest. So he goes to Shammai and says, I'm going to convert, but you have to make me the high priest. Because I want to look good. And of course, Shammai runs him away. He goes back to the play pretties. Some people, just like the Jewish toys, they want a talit, or they want a kippah, or they want a shofar, they want to have their name in Hebrew on jewelry or whatever. They're just looking at the play pretties. But a talit and a shofar, they don't make you a Torah keeper. We know that. There's a high price for such a thing. Shammai sends him away, but Hillel just starts teaching him. And when the Gentile finally makes it to Numbers 3:10 and 18:7, which define the priests as the descendants of Aaron, he goes to Hillel and he says, wait a minute, you said I could be high priest. He says, I know. He said, well, I can't be high priest. I'm not a descendant of Aaron. He says, I know, but I wanted to let you discover that. And so whatever our presumption might be, that we only really want to do this because we want to be somebody or be better than somebody else. Hillel was compassionate and smart enough to let the guy work through and find out on his own that you can't be anything you want to be in the kingdom. The crown of the Torah is for everyone, but the crown of the king, the crown of the high priest, those are crowns that it's kind of out of your control. But the idea there is that with Shammai, that measuring rod, and that being associated with the Gentiles and their relationship to the temple that we know later contributed to the destruction of the temple when the Gentiles were rejected ultimately. But we know again historically that the Talmud, in hindsight, is going to link the house of Shammai with the synagogue of Satan, because they were such literalists, because it was such a closed group, and they were adversarial. So we know also that what they did have in common, whether they were Hillel or Shammai, they believed in an afterlife. They believed that the righteous do not experience the torment of Sheol, that they would be taken to Abraham's bosom or gathered to their people is another expression, in the lower garden. Now, still there's some diversity in these beliefs. Some are going to believe that it's just a separate place of Sheol where it's not torment, but it's still kind of a prison because you can't get out of there and you don't have a body. And they think that this experience happens immediately after death. And this belief that ultimately there would be a resurrection to judgment and either eternal reward or punishment, a messianic kingdom, they preached a coming Messiah. That's what bound them together. They also believed that the wicked people and the intermediates would go ahead and descend to Sheol, which would have been the more torment place. And it would be possible for the intermediates or the lukewarm, as Yeshua called them, I believe in Revelation 3:16, that they could be purified and experience torment for up to 12 months, but repentance could shorten the term. There were classes of wicked that they said they never would come up from Sheol, certain people. But what they said is, in terms of the intermediates, not the completely wicked that are never coming up, but the intermediates that still have to have this purification process. One thing we read is that their afterlife experience is not in any way as supernal and blissful as that of the righteous. Such sinners, even after they exit from Gehenna, or Gehinnom in Hebrew, which would be like Sheol, are granted post-mortem repose of a lesser grade, that is, below that of the righteous, hence the phrase, at the feet of the righteous. That's the phrase I want you to remember from John's revelation, where he talks about the synagogue of Satan, and I will come and cause them to bow down at your feet and to admit that I have loved you. Right? Now we've got context who the synagogue of Satan might be, what they might be involved in that would be so objectionable, not just to the house of Hillel, but to Yeshua himself. Because he spoke into it, especially when he starts saying, quoting Isaiah, like a house of prayer for all nations. But this Jewish idea that, yes, they could go to the garden, but their location, and we don't know if this is a figurative phrase, exactly what it means, but at the feet of the righteous. Not exactly as pleasant. So when we read in Revelation 3:7, it says, he who is holy, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one opens, says this, I know your deeds. Behold, I have put before you an open door which no one can shut, because you have a little power and have kept my word, and have not denied my name. Behold, I will cause those of the synagogue of Satan who say they are Jews and are not, but lie. I will make them come and bow down at your feet and make them know that I have loved you. That's where context is so important. That's when it's so important to know who might he be talking about. What is the context that a first century reader already has of the synagogue of Satan, or somebody who would be at the feet of the righteous? Well, in a nutshell, remember, the synagogue of Satan, the seat of Satan, it could refer specifically to the school of Shammai, which rejected the inclusion of converts from the nations. There were times when it was called the synagogue of Satan by people in the school of Hillel, of which Paul was a member, by the way. Paul was a Hillelite. So the Hillelites are going to embrace the Gentile convert who wants to be included in the nation of Israel. They're going to reject the pride of the Shammaites, or the seed of Satan that would damn the Gentiles eternally to the prison of Sheol. So to Hillelites like Paul, excluding Gentile converts who would come to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to them, that was a very un-Jewish position. Why? Because they believed in the prophets, and if you believe in the prophets, then the prophets prophesy of the Gentiles being included in the temple worship. So if we go back to what they believed about the afterlife, then this hypocrisy and selfishness of those who wanted to exclude righteous Gentiles, John seems to be saying these people would be put in that intermediate class where their afterlife experience would be reduced in quality. Instead of being in these high, rich positions that they believe they're entitled to just because of their pedigree, just because their father was Abraham. Instead, that's going to be reduced in quality, and the Gentiles that they thought were the lesser are going to be raised up because of their faith. So they're not as rich as they think they are in spiritual heritage. They're not as entitled as they think they are in spiritual heritage. Because in the afterlife, that synagogue of Satan, as it's being called, is going to experience a kind of poverty, a lower position at the feet of those who only appear to be spiritually impoverished before they died, which is, a good reason to go back and reread Yeshua's parables, because he talks a lot about the afterlife. And there's another context that can help us from Yeshua's period, and that's going to be John the Baptist. Remember when some of the Pharisees are coming out to John in the Jordan to be baptized. He points out, basically, I think it's in Matthew 3:9, he calls them hypocrites. He doesn't just call them hypocrites, he calls them snakes. Yeshua's been known to call people snakes. But he points out their hypocrisy and he says, wait a minute, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? So obviously John is not going to be talking to Pharisees who are living very sincerely according to their faith. He's talking to hypocritical Pharisees who are coming to him asking for immersion to repentance when they have no intention of repenting. It's simply an outward thing. And a lot of them, remember, if they got into a bind doctrinally, they would just say, well, we're children of Abraham. We'll be good. We're descended from Abraham. And John the Baptist, he points out to them that being descended from Abraham is not going to secure you an afterlife free of this life's consequences. He tells them to start bringing forth the fruits of repentance as an illustration. Don't just come and dunk yourself in the water. Change your heart, change your life. Because after all, you really are the spiritual guides of the people. You have their hearts. It's incumbent upon you to live a spiritually transformed life, not a hypocritical one. In fact, the fact that he calls them hypocrites is implying that the authentic Pharisee is the one walking in a desirable faith. Because the definition of a hypocrite is going to be Strong's 5273, which is from 5271, and it means an actor under an assumed character, a stage player. So a hypocrite Pharisee is one only pretending to be a Pharisee. He's just an actor on a stage. He's lying about his true identity, because if he truly believed in his heart in judgment for one's sins and eternal reward or punishment, he would clean the inside of his heart as well as these staged behaviors. He would be a Pharisee both inside and out. That's the important thing, even of knowing a definition. What is a hypocrite? It's one who's only pretending. He's an actor on a stage. So going back to the Jewish tradition of the afterlife, it's the humble, it's the faithful disciples find that once they enter the garden, they're actually being given this rich position that the proud believed they would take. And it was there, the righteous would be given 2 crowns. And one of those crowns is mentioned in Revelation, which is the crown of life. He says, the first and the last who was dead and has come to life says this. So he's talking about it in the proper context. The crown of life goes in the context of afterlife. He says, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are of a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So the churches already knew what was written, but John is saying, hear what the Spirit is saying. Not just the letter, not just Shammai's literalist interpretation, but like a true Pharisee, one who preaches a transformation of the heart, one who preaches compassion and inclusion of the nations. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the assemblies, to the churches. So the crown of life is for authentic Jews, Israelites, as well as authentic Gentiles, Israelites who have been grafted into Israel. Now, Sheol has plenty of room for hypocrites. People who have believed that by some political, religious, economic, social, or military position, somehow that's going to translate to some high place in the kingdom. Whereas Yeshua is teaching that our faithfulness in spite of tribulation and poverty is true spiritual elevation, and that's what's going to lead to a crown of life after death. But there's an older context. It's not just a first century context. This phrase, bowing down at your feet, referring to those intermediates who there was such a purification process, they weren't going to ascend to the spiritual heights of the truly righteous. And that context is found in Isaiah 60:14. And that's important. In fact, if you do write in your Bible, that would be a great scripture to jot beside Revelation 2:8 through 11. Isaiah 60:14. Because if you want the context for what it means when somebody comes and they bow down at your feet, Isaiah straightens it out. And this passage of Isaiah 60 is in a section of scripture called the Consolation. And the Consolation chapters, I believe, are Isaiah 40 through 66. And if you're not familiar with it, we have just come through a period of annual mourning for the destruction of the two temples that starts on the 17th of Tammuz, and then it comes to a halt on Tisha B'Av. And then the Shabbat immediately following is called Shabbat Nachamu, or the Shabbat of Comfort, because the Haftorah begins with the words Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, or comfort, comfort my people. And so right now we are in this period of consolation and comfort that will lead up to Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. And significantly, these consolation chapters are read to prepare us for not just Rosh Hashanah, but Yom Kippur and Sukkot, which is nicknamed Sukkot of the Nations. So what does Isaiah say about bowing down at feet? He's just gone through quite a bit of prophecy. And this prophecy involves how the Gentile nations who had been adversaries of Israel, they're going to be transformed, and they're going to bring their wealth into Jerusalem. They're going to bring the sons and the daughters from afar. It's going to be a wonderful thing. The Gentiles are going to worship at the temple and so forth. And here's what he says. He says, the sons of those who afflicted you, and that would be the Gentile nations who afflicted you, will come bowing to you. And all those who despised you will bow themselves at the soles of your feet. So that's probably a phrase we can identify as the original context that at least twice, and maybe several more times in the Gospels, that the speaker is talking about there will be people who thought they were something, and then they'll find out they're not as big as they thought they were, and they'll have to bow themselves at the sole of your feet and admit, I've loved you. And admit that Adonai did love those among the Gentile nations, that he did give his only begotten Son, that whosoever, not just the Jew. Hillel recognizes it's not just the native-born Jew, that there are the righteous among the nations that can be brought in, because he believes Isaiah's prophecy. So in its original context, this consolation is to Israel, assuring them that even after the destruction and the exile, they will be regathered, they will be restored. The nations who tried to destroy Israel will instead bring their wealth and their worship to the holy city. And there's hypocrites involved in this process. And we find a reference to these hypocrites back in Deuteronomy 32:27, getting right back into the Torah. Moses is predicting that these Gentile nations are going to be instruments of Adonai's wrath upon Israel. But some of them will go too far. And he says, had I not feared the wrath of the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is high, and it is not the Lord who has done all this. In other words, they were the instruments of Israel's dispersion, but they became proud and thought they did it, and not Adonai, and it being part of his divine plan. He says, the time will come, I don't want them to misunderstand and think that they're going to get away with persecuting my people indefinitely. Because there's going to be hypocritical Gentile nations who will justify persecution of Jews, while at the same time they are sinning even more grievously. And so they're not recognizing we're only instruments, and we need to be humble too. Because if we're sinning worse than they are, then won't our judgment be even worse? And so in Revelation, we can see the evening, if you want to call it, of the playing field. We have the original context of hypocritical Gentile nations who were justifying persecution of Jews while at the same time they're transgressing. But there will also be Jews trying to keep the righteous Gentiles out of the kingdom, who are going to have to admit, yeah, we were hypocrites, and they're going to have to be relegated to a lower place in the kingdom at the feet of those whom they thought didn't even deserve to be included there. So we see it's a beautiful balancing. And here's the good news. Not every Gentile among the nations is a hypocrite any more than every Jew or Pharisee was a hypocrite. It's within these consolations to Israel that we have an assurance. It's embedded within this same text. In the consolations, it says the righteous Gentiles are going to have a place of worship in the temple alongside Israel. And so the house of Shammai, whose students were called the seed of Satan and rejected the Gentile convert and his sacrifices, that particular viewpoint is going to be exposed for what it is. Because Elohim created human beings and he loves them all, regardless of pedigree. And so it's within the text of the consolations that this inclusion of the Gentiles is predicted. And I believe it's Isaiah 56. where it says, as for the foreigners who hold fast to my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mountain and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. And so here's the kicker. It's the JPS Bible commentary on that particular Haftorah that points out what Isaiah is talking about is an inclusion of the foreigner into the covenant. Even the Jewish commentary is relating the ones who despised you in Isaiah's earlier consolation prophecy of the house of prayer for all nations. He's going to say there's basically two different kinds. The ones who are going to be judged as hypocritical. They were just looking for a reason to oppress Jews. But there's also going to be those with transformed hearts. They didn't despise you. They wanted to be part of the worship. And I'm going to make it into a house of prayer for all people. So, could the synagogue of Satan be something else? Yeah, it could. It could be pretty much any type of hypocrite. And by going back and reading Isaiah 56 through 66, basically, we can see two different types of Gentiles. We can see the ones who will persecute, and we will see the ones who are included. The same way that we can see that there will be Jews who will be hypocrites, the synagogue of Satan, and those who will be included. And I'm hoping that that's really the nutshell version. There's a lot of history behind this. But coming into Rosh Hashanah, as we're reading these chapters of consolation, I think it's really wonderful to see their context in the book of Revelation and in the Gospels, that the gospel is a plan of inclusion, not exclusion. But it's not unconditional. There's definitely a distinction between the hypocrite Pharisee and the sincere Pharisee, the hypocrite Gentile and the righteous Gentile. And in the book of Revelation, it's all together. It's one Israel. And if you're a hypocrite, probably the best you can hope for is being at the feet of the righteous. The worst you could hope for is spending some time in a hot place. But Baruch Hashem, I'm sure that nobody that puts this much study into the Torah is going to be found among the completely wicked. That we're learning how to be the righteous, whether it's a righteous Jew or a righteous non-Jew, but we're learning how to be righteous Israel. And not to practice hypocritical thoughts or deeds, but to be very sincere with our faithfulness to the word itself, our applications of the word itself, meaning the spirit of the word, not just the letter, not just the Shammai letter, but the Hillel compassionate spirit of the Torah. And we find that, especially if we go to Yeshua's teachings, talk about a shortcut, talk about a cheat sheet, we got it. Because when Yeshua put up a fence, it was the best kind. It was the most compassionate kind. It was the easy yoke. And it was about life. It was about achieving the crown of life. And I think with that, I think it clears the way for us to go forward, to wrap up with these 7 bowls of wrath, and to have a really good historical, even a cultural, in some cases, foundation. I wish I had time to go into the differences between the Judeans and the Galileans. Let me see if I can pull up one graphic I could show you. Here it is. Let me see if it'll let me screen share. Okay, can you see that? It shows you, and this is not a accurate diagram, by the way. It's just to show you the many circles when we're looking at the first century and we're trying to figure out not just who Yeshua is speaking with in the Gospels, what is the context of what John is writing, what is the context of what Paul is writing. But in the first century, you have this big group. At this time, they call themselves Jews. And it doesn't really matter what tribe they come from. Paul knows he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Hannah knows she's from the tribe of Asher. But that remnant that's left, their big identity at this point has now become Jewish. So within that big group, you've got the Judeans from the area there around Jerusalem, very hyper-religious. You've got the Galileans from up north who tended to be more prosperous because the climate up in the Galilee was more conducive to farming, to fishing, and so forth, trade routes. So it's called Galilee of the Nations. It was a crossroad for trade. And they were very independent-minded. They didn't always feel bound. Again, the Pharisees were in the Galilee, but probably the concentration was more in Judea, where religion was a bigger deal. As far as numbers, and I've got down here a circle showing you the Pharisees, and then those broken into 2 groups. A Pharisee could be from the Galilee, but like I said, most likely he's going to study someplace in Judea. And you've got the Sadducees, who tended to be the chief priests and scribes. And remember, they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead. But the Judeans truly saw the Galileans as country cousins. It would be like the difference between New York City and rural Alabama. That's the big divide between the two. I think the Judeans said that Judea is the grain, Galilee is the straw, and beyond the Jordan, chaff. So they didn't have a great opinion of Galileans. And that's why the challenge to Yeshua was like, all right, go to Judea and say that. Go to Jerusalem and say that, because that's a tough crowd down there. You've got these other groups out here like the Zealots, the Essenes, the Ebionites. And then you've got Jews who were like Paul, who appear to be Greek educated and perhaps much more Gnostic in their doctrines and beliefs. But see, you can't separate out those circles the way I've got them. I just wanted you to see how many groups were within first century Jews. And then if we started drawing lines, like say, there were Pharisees probably primarily up in Judea, but there could be Pharisees in the Galilee. A Sadducee could be a Hellenist. And Essene was likely a Judean, but he might be in a city of the Galilee. It's a huge train wreck, and trying to learn something and pin a definition on it. That's the challenge. But just to give you an idea of the numbers, there's an overrepresentation in the Gospels of Pharisees. Why do I say they're overrepresented? Because in Yeshua's lifetime, they had a huge context. Remember, they had the hearts of the common people. But how many of them were there? To give you an idea, Jerusalem, at the time of a feast, where you're going to have Jews not just coming down from the Galilee, Judea, but you might also have pilgrims coming from different cities, from different countries. The estimates were there were 3 to 4 million people in Jerusalem at the feasts. The total number of Pharisees was estimated to be around 6,000. So the ratio of Pharisees to the population itself was very low. So I say there's an overrepresentation in the writings, because Yeshua is running into these people frequently. Their background, of course, their interest is going to be religion. Especially if this unknown preacher comes from the Galilee preaching resurrection and judgment and eternal reward and everything they believe in. As far as core beliefs, of course they're going to have interaction with him. They're going to have conversations with him. And Yeshua is going to take the opportunity to point out to the Pharisees which of them are not living like Pharisees. And the same thing for the Sadducees. When he's expressing those woes that we looked at, I think it was last week or week before last, whoever you are, whatever group you're in, he's going to call you out if you're the actor on the stage. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a visual, at least, so you can visualize how many different groups you're dealing with, and that's not all of them, but who are going to add to these conversations and things that people in the first century would have understood about those people. I'm going to stop the recording here.